So there are those who are in the good standing and those who are in bad standing. وَالسَّابِقُونَ السَّابِقُونَ. This is now verse 10. And the Sabiqun, Muhammad Asad translates it as the foremost, or the study Qur'an also translates it as the foremost. Okay. والسابقون السابقون أولئك المقربون في جنات النعيم. So the three groups, the Maymana, the Mash'ama, and the third group is a Sabiqun. And the Sabiqun are muqarrabun. So they are the closest to Allah. If you will, they're the elite. And what Surah Al-Waqi'ah will tell us is that of the elite, there are a large, most of the category of the elite are, most of them are going to be among of the awwalun, which for now let's just understand it as the early generations and some of the later generations, al-akharin. And we'll come back to this. As to the Maymana, the people on the Maymana, it will be many from earlier generations and many from later generations. And it doesn't say anything about the composition of the Mash'ama. And this is, we start getting to the heart of Surah Al-Waqi'ah. So, first, al-muqarrabun. The foremost who are muqarrabun, who are closest to Allah, who will be described as having the elite status in the hereafter. And of course, that begs the question of who are they? And how, if it's possible to, or how is it possible to join that elite group of who are particularly close to Allah and who have a special status in the hereafter that is distinctive. And of course, what you run into immediately, is this a historical, is this saying basically, as a hadith of the Prophet or a hadith attributed to the Prophet that says that the best century was my century and then the one after it and then the one after it, and in other words, with the passage of time each century is worse than the one before? And does this mean that it's really most of those who have the high status in Jannah are those closest to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then as time goes by, fewer and fewer people will attain that status? Most Muslims, that's precisely the idea that they grow up with, is that, and this is what most Muslims would have been exposed to in Islamic centers and so on, is that it's just a matter of things, as with the passage of time, things get worse, and so your chances of joining that elite with each century is lower and lower and lower until you get to the final centuries. Okay. However, this runs into counter traditions that we should talk about. So first, I want to introduce an important hadith. This one reported from Aisha. She said that the Prophet ﷺ said, أتدرون من السابقون قال الذين إذا أعطوا الحق قبلوه وإذا سئلوا بذلوه وحكموا الناس كحكمهم لأنفسهم. So in this tradition, the Prophet ﷺ says, do you know who are those foremost that the Qur'an is talking about? And then he explains, and he says, they are people who adhere to rights and they adhere to the truth. If they hear the truth, they admit it and accept it. They're upright when it comes to the truth. And at the same time, when it comes to the rights of others, they are quick to satisfy the rights of others. So if there is a demand upon them that fulfill the rights of others, they are quick to discharge it. And if the way they carry themselves towards people, whether that carrying yourself involves a judgment or involves a position of responsibility, or involves being a judge, for instance, or involves being a ruler, whatever it is, in dealing with other people, they treat other human beings as they would treat what they would want for themselves. So, the golden rule, they treat others like they would want to be treated. Now, notice here, as-sabiqun are defined according to moral criteria, not a chronological criteria, but a moral criteria. They are truthful people, they are righteous people, they are people that do not take what is not rightfully theirs, and they are people that treat others like they would want to be treated. Now, some other traditions say that as-sabiqun are people who are al-musari'una fil khayrat, who excel in goodness, in doing good. They are always ahead of the curve when it comes to the performance of goodness, in service, in other words. So that seems to, these types of traditions, and there are many of them, that define as-sabiqun by moral criteria and not chronology, would leave it at least theoretically, abstractly open, that anyone from any period can be among the foremost. But it doesn't stop here, because the same time that we have the hadith that says the best century is my century and then each century is worse, we have hadith that says مثل أمتي مثل المطر لا يدرى أوله خير أم آخره, that my ummah is like rainfall. Whether the beginning of this ummah, the start of this ummah, the earlier periods of this ummah is better, or the last centuries of this ummah are better, is not known. And la yudra could mean that it's not decided yet by Allah, or it could mean that it is decided but we just don't know. Hadiths like this are these hadiths that talk about that it is not necessarily the case that the first centuries are the best and the last centuries are the worst. It leaves the matter open. But there are other ahadith that also talk about those who, and it's reported from Aisha. Did I write it? That talk about that the moral, how do I put it? That at the end of times, so maybe I'll be able to remember it if I read. Yeah. So okay. I'll paraphrase the hadith because I can't remember exactly the wording of it. But that the Prophet ﷺ tells his companions that there will come a time that the good deeds of a Muslim is worth 70 or 100 times what you do. And they asked the Prophet ﷺ, why is that? And the Prophet says, that's because in their time, the performance of good deeds will be much harder. You have awan, you have compatriots that help you to do good deeds. But those people who will be on the right path at their time, they will have a far greater challenge. And so they are rewarded 70 times in some versions, 100 times more, some versions, for the same deed that you do. Ibn Ajiba it says, for instance, المقربون في آخر الزمان أعظم رتبة وأوسع علما وتحقيقا لأنهم نهضوا في زمان الغفلة وجدوا في زمان الفترة. What he's saying is that those that come at the end of times and are on the righteous path, on the Islamic path, are of higher moral value or are closer in worth than people who would come at the beginning of times, because of how difficult it will be for them to go against the current. And he uses Zaman al-Ghafla and Zaman al-Fatra, and these are terms of art, the periods where, basically periods where of moral decay, and for those people. So we go back again to then when the Qur'an says that it will be ثُلَّةٌ مِنَ الْأَوَّلِينَ وَقَلِيلٌ مِنَ الْآخَرِينَ. Is it saying that most of the foremost, those who are close to Allah, most in terms of percentage-wise, are people of earlier generations, and this is, of course, doesn't have has nothing to do with the place of the Sahaba, because the Sahaba are the Sahaba, and the Ahlul Bayt are the Ahlul Bayt. But we're talking about beyond Ahlul Bayt and beyond the Sahaba. Here, الأول والآخر doesn't necessarily have a chronological meaning, but could simply mean that they are most of those who will be in the Sufuf al-Ula. So Ibn Arabi, for instance, says الأولين يعني المحبوبين الذين هم أهل الصف الأول من صفوف الأرواح, are those who stand closest to Allah in the hereafter, or is an indication of these are the ones that are going to. So in other words, in the hereafter, those who stand closer to Allah are the ones who are going to be most of, who occupy that space of the foremost, as-sabiqun. Now, why am I emphasizing this so much? Because of the shift in your psychology that Surah Al-Waqi'ah requires. We often care about our place in the class system that the world creates. Are you high class? Are you high middle class? Are you middle class? Are you low class? And it bothers us if, or we aspire to improve our class standing. And that's something that is very common to worldly life. If you are high class or high middle class, you want to remain that way and you don't want to slip down. And if you are low middle class, you hope to become middle class and then maybe even become high middle class. If you're high middle class, you might aspire to become high class. And we often think in terms of the way we organize our social lives is very much, how we price accommodations, how we price where we live, how we price what we drive, what we wear. It all relates to that class system. But we don't think very much about our rank in the hereafter. And that's the intellectual shift that Surah Al-Waqi'ah wants from you. And psychological shift. Because then you would think, well, I want to be among al-awwaleen. I want to be among those who are standing in the first lines, the closest man. And the closer I am, the more I know that I am guaranteed to be among as-sabiqun, the foremost. How many gradations among the foremost before you get to Ashabul Yameen, if we might use that expression, the middle class in the hereafter? And what type of gradations exist among Ashabul Yameen? Those who barely made it. And if you remember, we've talked about not just, but those who end up, they're really on the edge. They could either be among the Ashabul Mash'ama or Ashabul Maymana. But if a human being lives this world saying, well, I'm not just working to secure a place in Jannah, but I am working to actually be among the highest standing I can achieve. It would produce a reorientation, the type of reorientation that Sufi-esque tafsir often talk about, but they talk about by understanding a lot of the language metaphorically. And I don't even think that you need to understand the language metaphorically for Surah Al-Waqi'ah to have that effect on you. Okay.